Okay, a long time ago, three little trees grew on the edge of the great forest. But these trees were not like any other trees that you have ever seen because they could speak to one another. They did not talk in a way you could understand, but still they spoke to each other all day long. They talked about many things, the animals in the forest, especially the impish little squirrels that gathered nuts around their branches, and the little children that came into the woods to play. But most of all, the little trees liked to talk about what they would like to be when they grew up to be tall trees, with strong branches that flapped against the sky. The little pine tree said, "When I grow up to be a big tree, I want to be made into the palace of a great king." And you, the cedar asked the little ash tree, "What would you like to be when you grow up?" "Oh, I'm not too sure, but I think I'd like to travel all around the world. I guess I'd like to be a great big ship so that I could sail the seven seas." The ash tree replied, "Yes, that's it." It went on, getting quite excited. "I'd like to be part of the great ship and sail around the world." "No traveling for me," the cedar tree said. "I, for one, like to stay put." "Well, what do you want to be then?" the little pine tree asked. The little cedar's branches swayed gently in the breeze as it thought for a moment. Then it said slowly, "Yes, I think I know what I would like to be. I want to be a pulpit." "A pulpit!" the little ash tree exclaimed. "What a pulpit!" the small pine echoed. "Yes, a pulpit," the baby cedar repeated. "But why? Why a pulpit?" the pine tree asked, quite puzzled by its friend's ambition. The cedar did not answer, but remained quiet, thoughtful. "Tell us, please," said the ash tree. "Well," replied the cedar tree at last, "I think I'd like to help in my own way to make people love one another. Men are told to love each other from a pulpit, so that is why I would like to be a pulpit." "What a lovely thought," the pine tree said, still wanting to be a palace. "Yes, lovely," the ash agreed, but still thought of ships and the sea. The three little trees were so interested in their conversation that they talked and talked into the late evening. Already the sun was sinking beneath the distant mountain. Deep in the forest, the hoot of the owl told all the animals of the woodland that night was near, and it was time to go to sleep. "Oh, I am tired," the small pine yawned, stretching its branches. "Me too," the young ash tree said. "Good night," the little cedar said, and became very quiet. "Good night," the other little trees said, and they too fell silent, but still thought of their wonderful conversation. The pine tree wanted so much to be a part of the palace of a great king, and in its prayers asked God to make it happen. The ash tree also prayed, "Oh God, help me to become a great ship to sail all around the world." And the cedar tree always knew that God answered prayers, so it prayed very hard. "When I grow up, God, please help me to become a pulpit so that I can help people to love one another." By the time they had finished their prayers, it was now quite dark. Slowly, a great silver moon had crept across the sky, shedding its white light on the little branches of the three talking trees that were now fast asleep. Picture of the owl hooting. Oh my goodness. And so as time passed, the three little trees began to grow and grow. Each spring God gave them a new coat of bright green leaves to show that he loved them. They never, well, hardly ever forgot to say their prayers. But most of all, the pine tree prayed that it would become a palace when it grew up. The ash tree prayed that it would become a sailing ship, and and the good cedar prayed that it would become a pulpit from which the message of love could be taught. The cedar always knew that God would hear their prayers. 30 whole years passed before the sound of the lumberjacks were heard in the forest. The three talking trees were now tall and beautiful. Indeed, the oak was very, very old, said it had never seen such handsome trees. The pine tree was all tall and erect as a sentry outside the gate of the king's castle, and the ash tree had beautiful branches with bright green leaves that seemed to lick at the pale blue sky. The cedar was tall and magnificent. It had grown above most trees in the forest so that its top branches seemed to touch the clouds. "They're here, the lumberjacks," the pine tree said. It attended to the sound of the chopping somewhere in the forest. "Do you think they'll want us?" the ash tree asked, as the sound of men's voices could be heard coming nearer and nearer through the woodland path. "Yes, I think they will," the gentle cedar said. "But we must still be patient. We must wait just a little longer." No sooner had the cedar said that than 3 men carrying the biggest axes that trees had ever seen broke through the bushes at the edge of the forest and came towards the 3 talking trees. As the men got nearer and nearer, the trees prayed harder and harder that their wishes would be granted. The trees and the woodman. You can imagine how pleased the 3 talking trees were when the lumberjacks stopped in front of them and eyed their sturdy trunks knowingly. "Let's take these 3 fine trees," one man said to his friend. "They sure are fine trees," the other said as he picked up his very sharp axe. "At last," the cedar said, and quietly thanked God. "Hooray, hooray," the other 2 trees shouted with glee because their big adventure was about to begin. But of course, the men could not hear them, for human beings do not understand tree talk. Soon the swish and thud of the axes rang through the forest as the lumberjacks chopped through the thick trunks of the 3 talking trees. The squirrels scuttled up the rough bark of the gnarled old oak tree that was so sorry to see the 3 young friends leave the forest. The oak was sure it would miss them and all their talk about palaces, ships, and pulpits. The chopping even startled the cheeky little chipmunks that darted into the safety of the shrubbery and peeped out as the 3 trees, as they began to sway and totter under the powerful bites of the sharp axes. The pine tree was the first to fall. "Whee!" it cried joyfully as it toppled to the ground. Then there was a loud screech as the ash tree tumbled over and came crashing to the ground. The final stroke of the great axe brought down the cedar tree that fell like a great and mighty giant. "3 good trees," one of the men said as he wiped the sweat from his brow with a big red handkerchief. And so the 3 talking trees were cut down from their place in the forest where they had lived for many years. Soon they were on their way to the lumberyard to await the answer to their prayers. It was not long before someone came to buy the talking pine tree. It had been waiting for a king, but no king came. Instead of a king dressed in silk and velvet, a poor shepherd dressed in rags bought the pine tree. The poor shepherd, who came from a little village called Bethlehem, did not build a great palace out of the pine tree. Instead, he built a humble little stable. Pause.
Daddy's crying.
Well, pause your... I don't know if you run out of time or not.
Go ahead.
Okay. So he built a humble little stable for his animals. The pine tree was very sad and complained to God, "I asked for so many years to become part of the palace of a great king. And you have made me into a little table for oxen and donkeys." The pine tree cried because it had always thought that God answered prayers. Could it be, it wondered, that God does not really love me after all? Sometime later, a man came to buy the ash tree that had expected a gallant sailor that was looking for a good piece of wood to build a great ship that would sail the seven seas. But the only man who came was a poor fisherman. Instead of becoming part of a great sailing ship that was said the talking ash tree was made into a tiny little fishing boat that was to sail only on a small lake. The ash tree was very sad and prayed, "Oh God, why did you not answer my prayers? I wanted so much to be a great ship." I'm sweating. Only, only the General Cedar remained in the lumber yard, but not for long. One day, a rough-looking soldier came by and bought it. But instead of being made into a pulpit, for which people would made into a pulpit from which people would learn to love each other, the talking cedar tree was made into a cross on which someone was to die. The cedar was very, very sad because it could not see how God could answer its prayer. "Oh dear God," the cedar tree cried, "all I wanted was to be made into something for love, and I've been made into something for death. I'm so very sad." So the three talking trees thought that God had failed them after all the years they had prayed that their wishes would be granted. God seemed to not have heard them. The pine tree thought this until one winter day a man called Joseph arrived at with his wife Mary, who was riding on a little donkey. Not only did they stay at the humble little stable, but Mary gave birth to a baby there. Shortly after he was born, lots of people came and knelt before him. Shepherds brought gifts to him. Kings from the east came too with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Then the talking pine tree knew that the baby, whose name was Jesus, was no ordinary baby. He was more than a baby and even more than a king. He was the King of Kings. And so the pine tree was very happy because God had answered his prayers after all in a very wonderful way. Although only a humble little stable, it had become the home of the greatest king of all and would be more famous than any palace that would ever be built in the history of the world. It had been present at the very first Christmas, and maybe that is why pine trees are sometimes called Christmas trees. The talking ash tree, still dreaming of faraway places, spent many years on the little lake until it was bought one day by a big fisherman called Simon. One day Jesus came by and got into the little boat, and great crowds stood on the shore to listen to the beautiful words that he spoke to them. The ash tree was very happy because he knew that these words would travel all around the world and across the seas, 7 seas. Wherever they were spoken, the boat on which Jesus stood would be mentioned. So although it was only a small fishing boat, it would be a very famous boat, indeed perhaps the most famous boat of the world, in the world. God had answered my prayers, the ash tree said, but in a more wonderful way than I ever imagined. The talking cedar tree thought that it could never be happy as a cross. It thought God had completely forgotten all about it and all the prayers it had said as it grew up in the forest. it dreaded the day when some man would be hung on it to die. But when that day came, instead of being filled with sorrow, the cedar was filled with joy because it was Jesus who was on to die on the cross. Dear Jesus, the cedar said as he carried the cross up the hill, I thank you for hearing my prayers in this wonderful way. All I wanted was to be a pulpit where men would talk about love, but you have made me into a cross where you are to die for love. The cedar tree was the happiest tree that ever grew because from it Jesus taught the greatest lesson of love that the world has ever known. The cross would remain forever as the great sign of the wonderful love God has for men. So did God answer the prayers of the tree-talking trees? Not in the way that they thought he would, but in a much more wonderful way. And so we learn from the tree-talking trees that God does not always answer our prayers, but in his own way, and his own way is not always our way. The end.
Now read who it's to and from.
This book in the Christmas of 1976 was given to Rebecca Richard with love from Papa and Mama, and I'm guessing it must be Laperouse. It wasn't from me and Mama, it was from the Laperouses, I guess. Papa and Mama, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the talking trees. That's the end. Say good night, Becky. I cry a lot.